So we're going to start lesson 2 of chapter 3, and now we're going to look at the interactions between the different Earth systems. So how is the atmosphere working with the hydrosphere, or how is the hydrosphere working with the geosphere, or how is the biosphere working with the hydrosphere? And we're going to start out talking about the water cycle. So all of this water within the hydrosphere, what does it do? How does it move? How does it get from one place to the other? And so, water cycle, here's the definition, is the series of natural processes by which water continually moves throughout the hydrosphere. So, we're going to look at some of these processes, some of these movements, and we're going to refer back to this chart. We've used this before, but this is a phase diagram for water. So you have your three main phases here, and at the bottom you have your temperature in degrees Celsius, and then here you have pressure in ATM or atmospheres. So 1 atmosphere is the standard pressure. So our atmospheric pressure at sea level, or Earth's surface, is around about 1 atmosphere. And so we know that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, and we know that it boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So as we move through the water cycle, we'll refer to this and we'll kind of look at some of the ways that it actually changes phases and some of the ways that it moves. So the first part of our water cycle we're going to talk about is evaporation. Evaporation. Evaporation is the process of a liquid changing to a gas at the surface of the liquid. Now, you've seen examples of evaporation. In fact, I was driving to the school this morning, extremely foggy out. This is water evaporating off of from the moisture in the soil. You can also see it over lakes and ponds sometimes. But here's what's happening in evaporation. You have water changing from a liquid to a gas. So what's happening is it may not necessarily be, it's not 100 degrees outside, but what's happening is that water at the surface is getting enough energy to break away from the rest of the liquid and become vapor, become gas, evaporation. So here's what happens in nature. You have the sun providing that heat energy, and then you have here the ocean or a lake, or sometimes even the moisture in the soil, rivers, and that water at the surface takes in that energy and breaks away and becomes that rising water vapor that you see. Now, to go along with evaporation, we have what's called transpiration. Transpiration. Transpiration is the process by which plants release water vapor through their leaves. So what's actually happening is, we know that plants take up water, they absorb water from the soil through their roots, and it's drawn up through the stem and into the leaves of the plant. And so it uses this water, but the water that's not used actually evaporates from the surface. It transpires, and so that moisture goes into the air, and sunlight does the evaporating. There's also a process called respiration, and that is where we breathe, animals breathe, and water vapor goes into the air from our respiration. Now, together we refer to these processes as evapotranspiration. So you may hear that word and understand that's just a combination of evaporation and transpiration, evapotranspiration. So here you have the water rising up as a vapor into the air. Now, the next part is condensation. So once that water goes into the air, we see condensation. And condensation is the process by which a gas changes to a liquid. So you've seen when you take a glass of water, you take something cool, and you see it water droplets start to form on the outside. That is condensation. So what's happening in condensation is you have that water vapor in the air, and it is a gas, and its temperature starts to decrease. So as the temperature decreases, what happens to that gas? Well, you see here from the phase diagram, as we move back across that line, it becomes a liquid. So when we're here at regular atmospheric pressure and the temperature starts to drop, well, the energy starts to come out of those gas molecules and it becomes a liquid again. And so we see it forming into clouds, and those clouds, once they get heavy enough, they become precipitation. Precipitation. Precipitation is water in either a liquid or a solid form that falls from the atmosphere. We're familiar with precipitation. We know when you go outside and you see dark clouds, or you see that the clouds get heavy, that's precipitation about to happen. So there's different forms of precipitation. So remember, it's water in either a liquid or a solid form that falls from the atmosphere. So what happens is, up in the clouds, you get water coming together, condensing, coming together from a vapor into a liquid, and as warm air hits it, it comes down as rain. So that's the one we're most familiar with. But then let's say that it's not as much warm air. We can get what's called freezing rain. So that's where the particles, when they're solid, will become liquid, but then they'll start to freeze again as it comes through colder air. So frozen precipitation melts in warm air, and then rain falls and it freezes on that cold surface. Then there's sleet, where there's even less warm air, and frozen precipitation melts in shallow warm air. So that's this right here. And then it refreezes into sleet before it reaches the surface. So freezing rain, it's freezing down here as it hits the cold surfaces. Sleet, it's freezing in the air. And then, of course, well, maybe you don't know because we don't really get a lot of snow here, but snow is when it is falling in the form of ice crystals. So it's not hail so much as chunks of ice, but it is crystallized water. Water, we talked a little bit about this when we looked at the definition of minerals. Water actually does have a crystalline form when it is a solid. And so the shape of water, when it comes together, forms this lattice shape. And that's why we see snowflakes in those different patterns. It's actually the way that the water is freezing into crystals. And so it will fall and collect on the ground if it is cold enough. So any of these forms, and including hail when it is bigger chunks of ice, any of these forms is considered precipitation. So we've gone quite a bit of the way through. I want to just review this real quick. So condensation happens, if you remember, when this gas becomes a liquid. Now sometimes what can happen is this gas can go from directly from a liquid, or from a gas to a solid. That is called deposition. So the reverse, when it goes from a solid to a gas, is called sublimation. This is called deposition. So if it gets cold enough very fast, or if there's a decrease in pressure, so you're at a higher elevation, you have less air pressure. So let's say we're down below a certain point, the gas can go directly to a solid. And we can see this sometimes in precipitation, where you get hail, or some of even the sleet or freezing rain sometimes can result from deposition. And then the final part of the water cycle is collection. So you have all of this water falling, whether in rain or snow or sleet, and what happens to it? How does it get back to where it can go through evaporation or transpiration? Because remember, it's a cycle. So what happens is collection. Water runs off of mountains or plants or even surfaces of the ground, and it collects, goes into rivers, and rivers will flow into lakes or eventually the ocean. Groundwater can flow into lakes and the oceans. So all of the water is then collected after it falls as precipitation, or the snow begins to melt, or there's snow caps or things like that. It collects, and so it goes back into the cycle. And so then it starts all over again. And this happens over and over and over throughout history, but all over the world, and at different places you have different phases, because it can be raining in one place and a couple miles over it can have stopped raining, but then you'll see evaporation or transpiration taking place. So this is the water cycle. Be familiar with the different steps.